A 20% market decline does not destroy most people. Panic does. What destroys most people is the machine they volunteer to enter. First, the headline shocks them, then the imagination starts running. Then they confuse noise for risk, movement for danger, and cash for safety. By the time the machine is done with them, they have sold ownership to buy temporary emotional relief, and they call that prudence. I have watched this machine for most of my life. It changes its costume, but it does not change its behavior. One decade it wears internet mania, another decade it wears mortgage panic, another decade it wears a virus. Now it wears oil war, inflation fear, weak job numbers, and the old ghost people love to revive whenever they need a fresh reason to be afraid: stagflation. The machine always begins the same way. It takes a real problem, wraps it in an exaggerated probability, repeats it until it feels inevitable, and then forces ordinary people to make permanent financial decisions based on temporary emotional weather. That is how the machine taxes the middle class, not with one visible bill, with thousands of small frightened decisions. You think the danger is the market going down? I think the greater danger is you stepping out of the compounding machine every time somebody shouts fire. That is the first thing you need to understand. The market is not a comfort machine. It is not built to make you feel calm every week. It is a transfer machine. It transfers assets from the impatient to the patient, from the headline addict to the sober allocator, from the worker who needs reassurance to the owner who understands odds. Most people do not lose because they are unintelligent. They lose because they need emotional payment. At the exact moment the market is offering financial advantage, when fear becomes loud enough, they stop asking, "What is priced in?" They start asking, "How do I stop feeling bad?" That is a catastrophic question in capital allocation. If you ask the wrong question, the machine gives you the wrong answer. Right now, the wrong question is everywhere. Oil is up. The Middle East is unstable. Employment data is wobbling. Inflation might prove sticky. Politicians behave like arsonists. Commentators tell you this time the entire structure may crack. People hear all that, and they begin imagining a straight line from expensive gas to collapsing profits, to falling stocks, to permanent ruin. It sounds intelligent because it sounds severe. But severity is not the same thing as probability. I learned a very long time ago that intelligent investing starts by separating what is frightening from what is likely. Those are not the same category. A shark is frightening. That does not mean there is one in your bathtub. Stagflation belongs in that category. It is a word that gives television producers a warm feeling because it can do a lot of emotional work in very little time. It combines everything people hate into one package: expensive goods, weak growth, employment stress, shrinking confidence. It feels like a complete social trap, which is exactly why it spreads so well. But the market does not reward you for reacting to emotionally efficient words. It rewards you for weighting reality correctly. People talk as if any burst of oil fear automatically becomes a 1970s replay. That is lazy thinking. A system failure usually needs more than one loose wire. It needs a chain. And chains matter. When I study any financial risk, I do not ask whether something bad can happen. Of course it can. Bad things are always possible. I ask what exact chain has to stay intact for that outcome to become durable enough to damage long-term capital allocation. Once you ask that question, a lot of dramatic stories begin to fall apart. For a true stagflationary trap to take hold from oil, you need more than a spike and a headline. You need a sustained energy shock, not a week of panic. You need real deterioration under the surface of the economy, not one ugly data print. You need inflation transmission broad enough to infect the whole system. And most important, you need policy pressure that tightens into the weakness instead of cushioning it. That last part is where a lot of fear narratives quietly break, because markets love to price the movie poster before the script is finished. A few frightening developments appear, and investors rush to price the final disaster scene immediately. They do not wait to see whether the conditions are persistent, cumulative, and policy. Reinforced, they leap from tension to apocalypse. because emotionally it feels safer to overreact than to stay rational. That is not analysis. That is self-defense disguised as sophistication. I have no interest in that game. I never built my life around feeling the market correctly every morning. I built it around owning good assets bought under conditions where emotion was distorting price. There is a huge difference. The average person sees a sell-off and asks, "What if this gets worse?" I see a sell-off and ask, "What quality is being offered to me under the pressure of discomfort?" That sounds simple, but it is a completely different operating system. One operating system is built for psychological survival. The other is built for financial asymmetry. And if you spend your life using the first one, the second one remains closed to you. I want to make this plain. If oil rises and people get nervous, that is not irrelevant. It matters. If unemployment weakens, that matters. If geopolitical risk expands, that matters. What does not follow is the childish conclusion that because risk exists, ownership becomes a mistake. That conclusion has destroyed more future wealth than most bear markets. Because the true enemy of the ordinary saver is not volatility by itself. It is linear thinking. People see a decline and imagine continuation. They see fear and imagine destiny. They see bad news and assume the compounding machine has broken. Most of the time, all that has happened is the market has repriced short-term uncertainty, while long-term productive capacity remains intact. If you cannot tell the difference, you will keep selling the engine because you dislike the smoke. Now let me show you the deeper psychological damage. The market does not merely test your portfolio, it tests your identity. If you still think like an employee, you will crave stability, fixed outcomes, smooth monthly progress, and visible reassurance. You will want your financial life to behave like a paycheck. You will want no surprises. You will want certainty. But ownership does not function that way. Ownership breathes. It expands, it contracts, it scares you, it embarrasses you. It asks whether you actually understand what you own or whether you are only renting conviction during the good times. That is why workers and owners behave differently in the same market. The worker asks, "How do I avoid discomfort?" The owner asks, "How do I use discomfort to acquire better future cash flows?" The worker wants the machine to stop moving. The owner learns the movement is the price of admission. That is not poetry. That is structure. And if you do not internalize that structure, inflation will quietly finish the job that fear started. This is the part almost nobody explains, honestly. Cash feels safe because it is quiet. The problem is that quiet loss still counts as loss if you park your life in cash for long stretches and call it discipline. Inflation begins taking little bites that eventually become amputation. It is not dramatic enough to terrify you on a Tuesday, so most people underestimate it. There is no red siren, no breaking news graphic, no screaming commentator. Just slow purchasing, power erosion disguised as responsible behavior. That is what I call the silent leak. The silent leak is one of the nastiest features of the financial machine because it flatters your emotions while it harms your future. It tells you that because nothing is swinging on the screen, nothing dangerous is happening. That is false. A family that spends 25 years earning, saving, and hiding from ownership can discover at the end of the process that the dollars they protected have lost a shocking amount of real force. They were careful all along. They were obedient. They were conservative. They avoided headlines, and they still arrive with less power than they thought they had. That is not safety. That is decay without drama. I would rather face visible volatility with productive assets than invisible confiscation with idle cash. That does not mean all stocks are good or that price never matters. It means the relevant comparison is not stocks are risky, cash is safe. The relevant comparison is which risk are you accepting? And what does that risk do to your future freedom? One risk disturbs you temporarily, the other hollows you out slowly. Choose carefully. When people hear that, they often jump to the next foolish solution. Fine, they say, maybe I should not sit in cash. So I will become clever, I will jump in and out. I will sidestep every decline. I will buy the exact bottom. I will sell the exact top. I will outmaneuver the machine. No, you will not. You are not smarter than the machine in that way. Very few people are. Market timing flatters the ego because it makes you feel active, superior, and in control. But over long stretches, it usually turns disciplined savers into compulsive guessers. You sell once and feel brilliant. Then the market turns up without you. Now you need a second act. You need to get back in without admitting uncertainty. Then you wait for a better entry. Then you wait for confirmation. Then you wait for calm. Then you wait for a cleaner macro setup. Before you know it, the market has moved while you are busy negotiating with your own fear. I have seen that movie too many times. Perfection is an expensive addiction in investing. The market does not need your precision. It needs your endurance. That is why a simple buying discipline beats theatrical intelligence. So often call it dollar cost averaging if you like. Call it systematic accumulation. Call it anti-panic architecture. The label matters less than the principle. The principle is this: you build a process that does not require you to be emotionally brilliant. At the exact moment emotion is most expensive, that is real design, you remove decision points when decision quality is likely to collapse. You stop turning every dip into a referendum on your self-worth. You stop bargaining with headlines. You feed the ownership engine steadily. And when the machine gets more frightened and throws more quality onto the floor, you increase your appetite instead of your self-pity. That is how real wealth is usually built, not by one heroic trade. By a refusal to keep interrupting compounding. This is where history matters. People think every downturn is a final judgment because they are zoomed in too closely. They remember the pain, but not the duration math. They remember the panic, but not the recovery asymmetry. Over long enough periods, productive businesses and broad equity ownership have done something that frightened people find difficult to accept. They have absorbed wars, recessions, rate cycles, political chaos, bubbles, frauds, panics, and still marched upward because human productivity did not end. The path was ugly, the direction was not. That distinction has made fortunes for patient owners and left permanent regret for emotional spectators. If you had chosen the worst-looking entry windows in modern market history, you still would have discovered something uncomfortable for the permanent bear. Time is stronger than timing when the asset base is productive and the owner remains sane. That sentence sounds simple. Its consequences are enormous because once you accept it, the entire panic industry begins to lose authority over you. The fear machine needs you to believe every crisis is a new law of nature. I need you to notice that most crises are repricing events inside a much larger compounding system. Those are not the same thing. And that brings me to the opportunity hiding behind the current fear. Most investors are staring at the smoke. Very few are asking where the machine is actually starving. That is always the better question. The biggest money is rarely made by reacting to the loudest anxiety. It is usually made by finding the bottleneck the crowd has not yet valued correctly. During gold rushes, the crowd dreams of gold. The disciplined operator studies shovels, rails, and toll roads. During industrial shifts, the crowd worships the glamorous product. The disciplined operator studies power, transport parts, and choke points. During technological revolutions, the crowd usually overpays for the most visible story and underestimates the less glamorous component without which the whole machine stalls. That is where we are now. Artificial intelligence is not a parlor trick anymore. It is not a toy story. It is becoming infrastructure, a productive layer, a new computational engine that will absorb capital, labor, data, electricity, software, hardware, and eventually physical space on a scale that ordinary investors still do not fully grasp. People know this in a vague way. Vague understanding does not make money. Specific understanding does. Everyone can now say the words AI, chips, data centers, and automation. That is not insight. Insight comes from asking what part of the machine becomes impossible to ignore when the workload rises. The systems become more agentic. The context windows expand. The models become more capable. And the applications move from chat into execution. Robotics design, infrastructure, medicine, and control. Most people answer that question with compute. That is partly right. Some answer with energy. That is also right. But there is another piece of the machine that remains underappreciated, relative to the scale of what is coming. Memory, not human memory, machine memory. And if you do not understand why memory matters, you do not understand where the next choke point lives. Let's put it plainly, a machine that can process without remembering is not much of a machine. A model without enough accessible memory becomes a genius with amnesia. That may impress you in a demo. It does not build a durable economic layer. The more capable the system becomes, the more context it needs. The more context it needs, the more memory demand rises. The more you shift from simple answer generation into agents, workflows, tool use, persistent context, and physical execution, the more punishing that demand becomes. This is not optional. This is architecture. People are mesmerized by the visible intelligence and forget the storage and bandwidth burdens underneath it. That is a classic investor mistake. They see the theater at the surface and miss the plumbing in the basement. But the basement is where choke points live. I do not need every investor to become a semiconductor engineer to understand this. I only need you to see the direction of strain as chips become more powerful, as more transistors are crammed into the same reality, as models handle larger workloads, as software stacks become more persistent, and as machines move from responding to acting. Memory demand does not rise politely, it compounds. Today, a lot of people still talk about large language models as if that is the main event. It is not, it is an early act. Once systems evolve into persistent agents that can plan, remember call tools, carry context forward, monitor environments, and execute multi-step work, memory becomes even more central. Then robotics raises the bar further, because physical systems do not merely need raw intelligence. They need situational continuity. They need context over time, not just flashes of brilliance. And if the long arc keeps bending toward more general machine capability, then memory demand moves from important to absolutely unforgiving. That is why I call this the memory toll booth. A toll booth does not need to be glamorous. It only needs to sit where traffic has no alternative route. If the AI build-out keeps expanding, and I believe it will, then certain memory suppliers and adjacent choke point operators are sitting in positions the crowd still understates. Now let us walk through why this matters economically. When a market discovers a new obsession, the first phase is usually story inflation. Prices rise around the obvious heroes. Valuations stretch. Retail money chases the symbols everybody can pronounce. Then the second phase begins. Reality asks what the system actually needs in order to scale, not in theory and hardware and cooling and power, in data transfer and bandwidth and memory and manufacturing yield, in capital intensity. That is when serious investors stop chasing headlines and start mapping dependencies. The reason I have always liked the picks and shovels mindset is simple. A revolutionary industry can produce enormous wealth, but not every visible champion captures it. Some get commoditized, some get regulated, some overspend, some disappoint, some win technologically, and still disappoint shareholders because expectations outran economics. But the essential suppliers at the true choke points often enjoy a different quality of advantage. They are not selling dreams, they are renting access. That is a superior place to stand. In this AI cycle, people have already begun to understand the power problem. Data centers need electricity. Cooling needs infrastructure. Grids need reinforcement. That part of the case is no longer obscure. Good, it still matters. But once the market begins to understand one bottleneck, the next underpriced one is usually where fresh asymmetry hides. Memory is starting to look like that next asymmetry. And I do not mean memory in a vague conceptual sense. I mean the real industrial stack that allows increasingly intelligent systems to keep enough state, enough bandwidth, enough working context, and enough performance to operate at the levels the future narrative assumes. If the future narrative is large, the memory requirement cannot stay small. That is impossible. And when something is impossible, I pay attention. The next thing you need to understand is competition. Many investors hear the word cyclical and immediately step back. They have seen boom-bust patterns before. They have watched hardware names rise and collapse. They have scars that caution is not irrational. But good investing is not about classifying an entire category with one stale memory. It is about understanding whether the underlying structure has changed. A cyclical business with unlimited future supply is one thing. A cyclical business facing an extraordinary demand wave, extreme capital barriers, technological difficulty, and a concentrated competitive field is another thing entirely. If the number of credible suppliers is tiny, if the manufacturing burden is massive, if the expertise is hard-earned, if the capital required to catch up is enormous, and if the demand ramp may outrun industry expansion for years, then you have the ingredients for a very unusual stretch of profitability. That does not eliminate cycles. It changes their meaning. The crowd sees cyclicality and hears danger. I see constrained supply inside an expanding necessity and hear the possibility of a long toll road. Those are different ears. Look at the structure. The advanced memory field is not open prairie. It is narrow. A very small group controls most of the relevant terrain. New entrants do not simply decide to show up next quarter. This is not opening a sandwich shop. You are talking about years of capital expenditure, manufacturing complexity, technical skill, process learning, customer qualification, and execution. In markets like that, time itself becomes a moat that matters enormously. Because if demand can accelerate faster than competition can meaningfully appear, the incumbents are not just participating in a trend. They are sitting in a constrained lane while more and more traffic is forced through. That is the toll booth again. Now, let me bring this back to temperament, because no investment thesis is useful if your temperament collapses halfway through it. The crowd usually discovers a choke point in the wrong order. First, it ignores it, then it laughs at it. Then it notices a chart. Then it becomes nervous that it has missed it. Then it invents reasons why it must already be over. Then, after a larger move and more confirming evidence, it finally buys what it once dismissed. That behavior is expensive because it lets price do the thinking. You should never outsource your conviction to a chart. If the memory layer of AI is still early relative to the scale of demand ahead, then prior stock moves by themselves do not settle the matter. They may inform valuation discipline. They do not answer the deeper question, which is whether the industry is still entering a long phase where demand pressure, capital scarcity, and choke point economics can continue compounding. That question must be answered structurally, not emotionally. And the structural answer here is unusually compelling. As AI moves from fascination to infrastructure, memory becomes less like an accessory and more like a requirement. As systems become more context-hungry, the industry needs more of it as robotics, agents, and persistent workflows mature. The requirement grows again. As compute advances, memory stress does not vanish. It intensifies. That is the part many investors still treat too casually. They talk about intelligence as if it floats in the air. Number it sits on equipment, power, heat, bandwidth, and memory. The machine is physical. Physical machines create bottlenecks. Bottlenecks create economics. Economics create investment opportunities. If you skip those steps, you are not investing, you are cheering. Now, I want to say something uncomfortable but necessary. A lot of people will miss this cycle even if they are right about AI. They will miss it because they need social proof more than they need asymmetry. They want the thesis after the danger has disappeared, after the volatility has faded, after everyone respectable agrees, after every major publication has organized the story into a neat, reassuring package. By that point, the machine has already repriced the obvious gains. That is why ordinary people so often end up with scraps. They demand emotional certainty in markets where financial reward usually belongs to those who can operate with rational uncertainty. There is no way around that. If you need permission from the crowd, you will pay the crowd's price. That is not a small penalty. It is one of the most expensive habits in investing. This is why I have spent so much of my life preaching variants of the same message. Independence is not only moral, it is financially productive if your mind is rented to headlines, price action, and group emotion, your portfolio will eventually reflect that dependency. You will own what feels socially safe, not what is structurally attractive, and social safety is usually overpriced. Let me give you a simpler mental model. Think of the financial world as three machines. The first is the wage machine. It pays you for time useful, but linear. The second is the consumption machine. It invites you to spend, signal, upgrade, and stay dependent. Emotionally seductive, financially corrosive. The third is the ownership machine. It converts patience, discipline, and rational allocation into expanding claims on future cash flows. Most people live inside the first machine, get drained by the second, and never meaningfully commit to the third. Then they wonder why freedom keeps moving farther away. Now, inside the ownership machine, there are moments when the gears become visible. The market gets scared, prices wobble, narratives darken, weak hands release assets. That is not a failure of the machine. That is one of the moments when it becomes generous to people who are prepared. And sometimes inside those fearful periods, a new submachine is forming beneath the surface. That is what I think is happening with AI infrastructure broadly. And memory specifically, the crowd is busy arguing about whether the latest macro scare changes the next 3 months. I am more interested in whether a decade-scale computational build-out is creating toll booths that still are not fully owned by long-term capital. Those two questions do not belong to the same universe. One is trivia wearing a necktie, the other is capital allocation. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not telling you to abandon valuation, quality, or prudence. I am not telling you that every name in the stack will win. I am not telling you the path will be smooth. It will not be. There will be drawdowns, narrative reversals, industry concerns, and cyclical scares. People will rediscover old worries and present them as new wisdom. Good. That is how the machine keeps prices from becoming too easy. Volatility is not the enemy of the long-term owner. It is part of the delivery mechanism. The real enemy is conceptual laziness, failing to distinguish between the visible face of a trend and the hidden choke points under it, failing to distinguish between a low probability macro horror story and a high probability long-run technological build-out, failing to distinguish between emotional relief and rational positioning. That sort of laziness is what leaves people overexposed to mediocrity and underexposed to exceptional compounding. Personally, when I see fear around oil, inflation headlines, and geopolitical noise, I do not ask whether I should become paralyzed. I ask what the panic is hiding. Sometimes panic hides fraud, sometimes it hides excess, and sometimes it hides a toll road being built while everyone is staring at smoke. This time, I believe there is a toll road. I think energy matters. I think cooling matters. I think manufacturing capacity matters. I think the memory layer may matter far more than many investors currently appreciate. If you want a practical expression of that idea, you can think in terms of owning the stack rather than worshiping one symbol. The fabrication side matters. The equipment side matters. The power and thermal side matter. And inside the memory lane itself, select leaders with the right positioning, scale, product focus, and structural advantages become especially interesting. If I wanted to express that memory thesis directly, I would pay close attention to the tiny club already controlling the crucial lanes, especially businesses like Micron, alongside the major Asian memory leaders, because concentration matters when demand is accelerating, and new rivals cannot simply appear by next quarter. Around them sits the wider machine, equipment makers, foundry operators, power enablers, and cooling infrastructure. I do not need one heroic symbol. I want exposure to the toll roads that become more essential as the AI machine grows hungrier. I will say it even more bluntly. The next great phase of AI may not be won by the loudest dream seller. It may be monetized most effectively by businesses that solve the physical choke points. Everybody eventually must pay. That is one of the oldest patterns in capitalism. The new frontier gets the glory, the bottleneck gets the economics, the crowd wants the glamour, I want the toll booth. That is a mindset difference, not a slogan. And mindset differences compound. At this point, you may be thinking, what if the macro fear is not wrong? What if the oil shock drags on? What if growth slows? What if the market falls anyway? What if all these good long-term ideas get marked down with everything else? Of course they might. That is not a rebuttal. That is the environment in which ownership is usually transferred. A wonderful asset bought at a foolish price can disappoint you. That is true. A wonderful asset bought over time with discipline, while fear periodically gives you better terms, can change your life. That is also true. The point is not to predict every tremor. The point is to position inside the right machine and survive the noise without sabotaging yourself. If you can do that, volatility becomes a servant rather than a judge. If you cannot do that, even a great secular trend can fail to enrich you because you keep firing yourself from your own strategy. That is more common than most people admit. There is another reason this moment matters. For years, ordinary investors have been trained to think in headlines rather than systems. They think in episodes: a war, a speech, a data release, a tariff, a rate meeting, a sell-off, a rally. They live from spark to spark. But wealth is usually built by understanding systems. Systems tell you what persists beneath episodes. The episode today is fear. The system underneath it is a long-duration expansion in computational demand. The episode today is oil. The system underneath it is that intelligence infrastructure still needs power. Memory, cooling, and manufacturing, whether the headlines are elegant or ugly. The episode today is nervousness. The system underneath it is that ownership of choke points remains one of the cleanest ways to convert technological change into financial gain. Once you start seeing systems, short-term drama loses some of its spell over you. That is not because you become numb. It is because your time horizon begins doing protective work for you. Long horizons are psychological armor. They stop you from overpaying attention to passing weather and underpaying attention to structural shifts. Most people do the opposite. They treat a storm as destiny and a decade as abstraction. That inversion is ruinous. I would urge you to reverse it. Treat the day as fear, as weather. Treat the decade as bottlenecks, as destiny candidates. Now we arrive at the real test. Not whether you can repeat the thesis, not whether you can name the tickers, not whether you can post clever remarks about AI on the internet. The real test is whether you are willing to leave the fear machine and re-enter the ownership machine while uncertainty still exists. That is always the cost. You do not get paid for acting after the doubt is gone. You get paid for carrying a rational framework through periods when doubt is still being sold aggressively. That does not mean recklessness. It means adulthood. Build your watch list. Study the stack. Understand the memory toll booth. Respect the power layer. Respect the manufacturing layer. Respect valuation. Build a plan for adding over time instead of improvising under stress. And most of all, stop confusing a loud macro story with a broken long-term machine. They are not the same thing. The market will tempt you, as it always does, to become theatrical, to become urgent in the wrong way, to turn uncertainty into a personality, to act as if being scared makes you serious. It does not. Being structured makes you serious. Being patient makes you serious. Being able to distinguish between a smoke cloud and a collapsed engine makes you serious. That is what I want for you. Not permanent optimism, not permanent bullishness, permanent clarity. Because clarity is what lets you do the hardest thing in finance. Hold a rational position while other people are renting irrational emotions from each other. That is where extraordinary outcomes begin. Here is the door in front of you. On one side is the old life. You let headlines decide your level of courage. You sit in cash too long. You call decay safety. You chase certainty until the price of certainty becomes unbearable. You arrive late to every major opportunity and spend the second half of your life explaining why the winners were obvious only after they had already won. On the other side is a different life. You accept that the machine will always use fear to shake ownership loose. You build an anti-panic system. You learn the difference between visible noise and structural demand. You stop worshiping glamour and start identifying toll booths. You use volatility to accumulate rather than to surrender. You think like an owner while others beg to feel like spectators. One path feels safer now and weaker later. The other feels harder now and freer later. Most people will know which door is better and still refuse to walk through it, because the first door charges them in silence, while the second charges them in courage. That is the whole game. You do not need a perfect forecast. You need a better machine, and you need the nerve to stay inside it while the world tries to wrench your fear.